Hello, my name is Cullen, and welcome to Miniature Painting by Cullen. Today I am painting the swords on the Dwarf Agent from Massive Darkness. I am going to be doing a non-metallic type of finish on the swords, and I'm going to go through the process. So sit back and enjoy, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. The first thing I'm doing is putting down the base color, which is a scale 75 graphite. The cool thing with scale 75 paints, they do come in like a color box, and this one came from the metal or non-metallic metal box, which gives you different shades to create a non-metallic finish. Also, I did get a chance to upgrade my camera, so hopefully it's a little bit more clear and a little bit more enjoyable to look at. If you can see my palette, I've already laid out my colors. Basically, it's let's see, it is the base color, like I said, is the graphite color from scale 75, and then first, I'll be going in the down direction, down into the shadow areas of the sword or swords, and pretty much going from a anthracite gray. It's a weird name. And then moving down to an abyssal blue for my shadows. And then from there, I'll be working up into my highlights with Nakar from scale 75, and then onto just white. As you can see, as I'm painting these first coats, I'm kind of sketching in the color. It's not really looking really nice and pretty, and it kind of looks pretty bad. But as you work through and building your layers up into your highlights and down into your shadows, and kind of feathering and blending everything together, you'll start to see everything come together. You'll also notice that I go back from, again, into the upper highlights, and then I'll go back down into the lower shadows, and trying to pull out the details of the sword, such as the recesses, the three recesses. I'm not quite sure what they're called, and trying to get an edge on those as well. You can see from the notes there, it's scale 75 Nakar for that mid-tone highlight. Again, this all came from the non-metallic paint set from scale 75. They kind of make it easy, and they kind of give you an idea of how to use these paints in this way. I strongly recommend these paints if you want to do non-metallic metals. On the miniature, you can also see that I already did the non-metallic hilts with gold. Again, that formula is also taught to you or given to you in that paint set as well. Again, working the upper shadows in a very thin layers. You try not to want to do thicker layers, as you don't want to get the texture of the paint on the actual mini itself, and you want everything to be flat with no texture or paint check texture, unless you're painting it in. Currently, right now, I'm worked my way up to the white paint into extreme highlights, trying to get that glare of light onto the swords themselves. This is a very simplistic way of doing non-metallics. I'm not actually putting in a secondary highlight or having a very sharp type of contrast or sharp edges to create that contrast, which is very common with non-metallic metals and painting on metallic metals. As you can see, I went back down to my lowest shadow. Again, I'm going back and forth, getting those colors in, blending them, and getting the look that I want. Also, if you're looking at the way I'm painting, I'm using different parts of the actual brush. Right here, I'm using the tip of the brush, but if you see me painting the highlights on the edge of the sword, you'll see me using the edge of the brush and not the tip. It's just a common technique to get a nice fine edge with edge against edge instead of actually painting on that edge. At this part, these little indents, again, I'm not quite sure what they're called. It was a little harder, and you kind of have to paint those highlights in on that edge, and it wasn't very deep, so you'll see through this video that I'm constantly going back and putting in the shadows into the indentations that you see there, and then putting a highlight on there or painting a highlight on there, and then going back and getting that shadow back into there. It was a back and forth kind of process, but finally I got the look that I want. It took a little time. A lot of it was done off camera. The same technique was also used on the metal parts, or the metal kind of hexagon plates on the front of his body, and they're on his gauntlets as well, or glaives on the back of his hands and wrists, and I'll also be doing that on the metal parts where his ears are as well. Again, you'll see in my little highlight there, or note, I'm using, this is my extreme highlight, or highlight 2, which is the white, again from the scale 75 range. It's a little sketchy again, as I'm laying down the colors. I also, later on in the video, I'll be adding a glaze over the work that I've done. and it's a kind of a bluish glaze, kind of that give that bluish kind of tint to the metal, kind of give a little bit more color to the metal, make it a little bit more interesting to look at. I use two glazes, and one of them, the first glaze is a Caspian blue, and the second glaze is the Abyssal blue. How I get that glaze kind of a mixture is 90% water, 10% paint. So it's really watery. You're putting a lot of layers on to create the tones that you want, but you're seeing the paint underneath. Again, still working on those highlights. Here's that point example of using the side of your paintbrush to create more of a straight line. These swords were a little interesting because they're not actually, there is no straight line down the middle of the sword, so it was hard to get kind of that highlight. Again, there's that example of using the side of your brush. I kind of went back and put those extreme highlights back on to the gold non-metallic as I kind of went over trying to fit in my shadows and fixing those mistakes. As you can see, I've already pretty much got my highlights and my shadows in the swords, so I'm just again refining what I've already done, making them blend a little bit more and better, and again going back and forth. Trying to do the edge with my brush on that little indentation of the sword. Just going back and forth. You'll see that I constantly go back and forth. One of the things with scale 75 or most colors in general, the color that you see on the palette is it takes a little bit more to work your way up to that color, and sometimes when you paint it onto the miniature, the color underneath actually kind of affects the color itself, because again you're working in thin layers, and so you're kind of have to go back constantly over a spot and to get your color up where you need it to be. Again, putting in that shadow again with that Abyssal blue. As you can see, I don't really. Sometimes when I'm in the process of painting, I don't, because the paint is really thin. It doesn't necessarily actually stay in the brush, and what you'll see sometimes is with me in my painting is I will constantly be going from one color to the next, and not necessarily be washing the brush off in my paint or in water, and just going from one color to the next. One thing you do with that is sometimes you can create blends, because you have your highlight color on the tip of your brush, and then you already have your darker color underneath. So it is, I forgot what it's called right now, but it's a blending technique. So inadvertently, you start off with your lighter color that you just put on, and then you, as that color leaves the brush onto the miniature, you still have that other color underneath that is still kind of there, and so you kind of feather it out. So you're feathering that highlight and down into that shadow. But again, I when I'm working in this capacity and working in just small, thin layers, I rarely wash off my brush, and kind of have all the different tones that I'm working with kind of mixed in slightly. But because they're so thin, it doesn't really matter. Again, using the side of my brush to create that edge. As I said in other videos, this is actually a miniature for a good friend of mine. We play Massive Darkness together, and he got his own set, and he wanted me to paint, or I'm painting a miniature for his birthday. And I'm painting this miniature to a display standard, and usually that's the way I like to paint, is somewhere between a high tabletop standard to display, and somewhere in between. Usually that's where I paint. Again, trying to get those shadows in those indentations of the sword. Trying to create what I'm doing here is making it really dark towards the hilt of the sword, because I'm knowing I'm creating a contrast between the sword itself and the hilt, which is gold, and it has its own contrast, extreme highlights with the white. And so what you're doing is making those edges pop as you're putting in that darker color. So at this point, as you can see up in the top of on the palette, I have created my first glaze. Again, that is a Caspian blue. It's a 10% paint and 90% water. And I'm basically going over the whole of the sword with this color. Again, creating a bluish kind of tinge to it. In a second, you'll see me kind of make a darker glaze with the Abyssal blue. And I just put those, or painted those down into towards the hilt and on the underside of the sword to create more of a shadow. Also with the glazes, they're really handy because they're really good on blending all the colors together that's on the sword itself. As you can see with that, during that glaze, sometimes you want to bring out the highlight again because you kind of just muffled it with your glaze. And so I'm going back and very fast putting in that extreme highlight again in there. I think, yep, still going with the extreme highlight, just bringing that back in as you toned it down with your glaze. Going back with the blue. So basically, the blue was kind of still drying the first layer. So at this point, that first layer has dried to an extent, and then I am painting a second layer. Just and as you can see, the blue is really starting to pop a lot. Okay, as you can see, I'm just putting a drop of that Abyssal blue in the paint basin, or not? Yeah. Sorry, no, I'm still getting those. Oh yes. Sorry, it's not in frame. The Abyssal blue wash. So this is actually a wash that I'm putting on here. Again, it's the 10% paint, 90% water, and just kind of getting that deep kind of shadow in that paint, extending that blue to an even deeper blue. Again, with the glazes, you don't want to put a whole lot, usually 2 to 3 layers, and these are really thin layers, and again you see everything underneath it. They just you're just creating tonal variances with color. So I might go back with these swords and actually do a brown or brownish oranges glaze to create kind of a rusty, kind of dirty kind of look on these as well. I'm not quite sure if that's what I want to do yet. Again, I want to say thank you for watching this video. There's going to be a lot more videos to come. I know this is the third video in my series with this Dwarf agent. I think it's going to be the last because I'm pretty much done. I just have to do the leather bags, pouches on his side. I already did the base. Again, going back again, I'm bringing out those highlights. Again, I want to say thank you, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.